All right, so we're excited to have a guest today that Robin's going to introduce, so I'll turn it over to you.
Today, we are pleased to welcome Jennifer Clark to the Glenn College. Jennifer is the section head of Ned's other boss, and distinguished professor in city and regional planning. She also has a courtesy appointment in the Department of Geography. She's the editor of the Journal of Regional Science. She's Regional Studies. Sorry, Regional Science is also in at OSU. Or no? All right. Well, she's fellow of the American Association of Geographers and the Regional Studies Association. Before coming to Ohio State, she studies her doctoral studies at now. Before that, in regional planning. Before that, she was at the Humphrey School, where she earned a master's degree. Her job, she came to Ohio State in 2019 from Georgia Tech, the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. Her research focuses broadly on regional economic development, and her teaching likewise teaches courses on urban and regional economic development theory, analysis, practice, and research design. She's authored and co-authored 4 books, the last 2 of which have won national awards: Uneven Innovation, The Work of Smart Cities, and Remaking Regional Economies, Power, Labor, and Firm Strategies in Knowledge Economy. Today's talk is Remaking Regional Economies and Growth and Change. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be over here. As Rob mentioned, I got here in 2019, and to those of you who know your recent history, what that means is about the same time I figured out the names of the faculty I was supervising was the time that COVID hit. And so I did not get a chance to do things that people usually do when they're new to an institution, like wander over to the Glenn College and introduce themselves. So I barely got as far as reaching out to the geography department before everything sort of got a little bit pear-shaped, as I like to say. And so it's really nice to be over here today. And kind of a little bit of I found that the last year or so is a little bit of a restart, which is kind of nice. I'm really pleased to see see so many people in person. We were just talking for a minute about the difference between doing these colloquiums in person or doing them online with some Zoom, and the sense of community you get when you're in person is just super, super important. We actually have our colloquium that we schedule at the same time as yours, following your great idea of having lunch on Monday. And we do it in person exclusively now. I will say that I can see online right now some of my fantastic students and colleagues. So now you're making me think that options is a really nice option to have. So the talk that I wanted to give today was a little bit of balancing some of the work background in my work that some of you may be familiar with, some of it, other pieces of it. Remaking Regional Economies was actually the title of my the first book I wrote, and I find that I return to it over and over again. And as we're talking about all of the changes in Central Ohio, I find myself thinking about this book and some of the thoughts again. So I wanted to share some of those with you. The other thing I wanted to mention is, those of you who might know that the City of Regional Planning is in an architecture school here. We're in engineering college, architecture school, city and regional planning. I think that's the most fun. That was one of the reasons I came here. I thought that was actually a really fun structure for us. But it does mean that I had to learn how to put images in my slides. And I had to learn how to be very image dependent in my slides, which was not what happened after being 14 years in a public policy school. There were different things in my slides when I was in a public policy school. But most of these images are, not all of them, but the vast majority are images that I put together as part to illustrate what I'm talking about. So what I always say to students who think maybe like this is getting a little boring, guess where the pictures are. But this is because they are actually related to the text that we're talking about. Many of them are images that I've taken on my own field work. Some of you may be familiar with this one. I actually picked these two so that you could actually see the names of the places to get us started on using images as how we're learning about regional economy. Chelsea Market. Anybody know where Chelsea Market is? Ned knows.
Or you can tell by the camera.
Yes, you can. So this is New York City, this is Chelsea Market. Google is in this building in addition to a number of other, interesting things. Front City Market, anybody know where that is? Go ahead.
That's Atlanta, right?
It is. Both of these are industrial redevelopment projects, essentially older buildings that adaptive reuse projects. They were also both done by the same company, Jamestown Developers, which is a German-based company. So that's what it takes to redevelop buildings in our city, is it takes sometimes actually people coming from Europe who understand more about redevelopment. Now, this is starting to change. This is starting to be something that US real estate developers understand better. But it's been taking a little bit of time, especially for the very, very large projects that US real estate developers think it's been a little bit more risky. So the context that I wanted to talk to you about today really has to do with, I'm new to Central Ohio in many ways, although I guess 5 years is not that new, but I'm a little bit new. And one of the things that people talk to me about, and I'm sure they talk to me about this quite a bit, is the sort of anxiety that's going on in our region around influx of firms, particularly large lead firms like Intel, but the question of how that's going to change the region. One of the things that you notice when you talk to people about this region is that keeping Columbus and how great Columbus is as secret is something that is actually one of the things that people are trying to keep a little quiet. Don't want too many people to find out about how well things work here. So this idea that it actually we're on the map for things like Intel, that you see some anxiety around that from people who in the region. Things about housing. Things about transportation, things about all of those pieces, but also from the question of how are we going to actually connect these new firms into local and regional supply chains? What's it actually going to mean in terms of embedding in the region? Is there a way to actually embed these firms in the region, and is there a way to actually support startups and scale ups as they sort of become part of that supplier network? These are classic questions in economic development, and they're very large questions, particularly in international economic development. Questions around how startup and scale up happens is a huge part of what OECD spends a lot of time to figure out. And this question of embedding, it's a question that particularly when we talk about places that have gone through long deindustrialization stories, the question of embedding is important because branch plants tend to be particularly fluid. So why do I want to talk so much about regional economic development planning? I want to give you a little bit of a context for this. Anybody know where this is? Okay, this is Piccadilly Circus. You would think for as cool as the place and interesting as it is, why would you need this on here? You've got these amazing buildings anyway, but technology is everywhere at this point. But just to give you a sense about when we talk about regional economic development planning, what we're talking about is the focus of the analysis. We're talking about a sort of a subdiscipline or a field that's come out of economic geography, regional science, and regional development. Rob was mentioning that I'm the editor-in-chief of Regional Studies. Regional Studies is an international interdisciplinary journal, which means that we're juggling a lot of this across a lot of different national contexts. And also the question of how people understand region, which I will tell you varies by national context. So I think it's important sometimes to just illustrate what we're talking about. And we're talking about empirical description. That's part of what we're trying to do in this field. But we're also trying to identify the factors that actually influence the variation in the spatial distribution of economic activity, right? We're trying to analyze the outcomes of that, and we're trying to model those relationships. That's the predictive planning part about that, of the factors and outcomes. And then finally, the part that's really important for policy is the part where we're actually trying to understand what interventions can happen to influence the distribution. So if you think about something that's a big issue in economic geography, economic development, questions around uneven development, questions about why some places win, why other places lose, this sort of question about the maldistribution of economic activity. It's understanding what actually those levers are that are possible for local or regional or even national economic developers to be involved in. So one of the arguments we make in regional development is that when we think about regions in terms of a broader global context, that regions are really where globalization hits the ground. the idea that we're actually seeing regions as the scale of action in the global economy. And we could talk a little bit more about the literature that sort of makes this argument. Regions become the sites of regulation, redistribution of risk, and renegotiation. That's sort of the thematic understanding here. So the idea is that regions can actually position themselves. There's some agency that regions have when they position themselves within the regional economy. Think back to the question of how is Columbus going to reposition or redefine its position if it becomes sort of an advanced manufacturing hub, a technology manufacturing hub with this new influx of firms. So one of the reasons this is really important, does anyone know what this is?
Seattle?
It's a really good guess that it's Seattle, but it's actually not.
So the High Line.
It is the High Line. This is the High Line during COVID, where they started to put signs about social distancing, even though it's an outdoor park, right? They're still trying very hard.
What is the High Line?
The High Line is the linear park in New York City, where they another adaptive reuse project where it was rail lines has now become one of the sort of marquee urban redevelopment project. One of the interesting things about it is it really is just an elevated rail line that's become a park, but the amount of real estate activity and gentrification that's created is substantial. So this also feeds into much more conversations about how much intervention do you have to do in the physical environment in order to actually change what's going on in local land markets. So this is the first book that I wrote on this question, and this predates my conversations about smart cities and uneven innovation. But I have to say it really informed it. And this is the arguments here were really about regional innovation systems. And I just want to share some of these because it will make a little bit more sense as I keep going. Moving from this original point that I was making, that regions present firms with strategic options, not just production locations. For those of you guys who have done a lot of work in development on the question of sort of why firms locate where, right? We often talk about things like rivers, roads, things like that. Those are the traditional understandings of this. But it's actually strategic options, right? So to think about it as whatever the assets are that are involved in a particular region, not every time does a firm pick places with the best labor market. Sometimes they want a medium skilled labor market. So you think about it as a question of balancing strategic options in a portfolio. The other point to make is that power matters in firm networks. I say firm networks here because every time I give this presentation, somebody says firm networks versus soft networks. And I said, no, I mean firms like companies. And so the S is the only way I can do that fast. But the idea that when we talk about industry clusters or we talk about networks of firms, there are power asymmetries that operate within those. And those actually change the characteristics of the operations of those firm networks in those regional markets. The other thing to keep in mind is that labor skills are central to firm costs, but also to their innovation strategies. And we see this I see this more in the College of Engineering, as we look at Intel coming in and some of their firms, the amount of pressure that comes to the College of Engineering about upgrading and creating programs to in fact create a particular kind of skill set is one of the things that comes on the papers all the time. And then of course, regions become a source of subsidy and risk reduction. So again, you can understand how that works in part because if you've got the institutional infrastructure in any given region can actually help a firm reduce its risk in terms of labor market reproduction or in any number of ways. You can think about that as transportation as well. So just to say that, I'm going to go forward for a second. So one of the things about the promise of Intel is that this idea that we're moving away from the sort of traditional advanced manufacturing or traditional manufacturing types of regional industrial specialization. So in the past, we would think about, a region and an industry, right? That's the way we've thought about it. That's the stuff I study. That's the way that is the familiar these things. But one of the things that's happening more recently is we're seeing the adoption, let's see if I can go backwards, we're seeing this idea that the specialization is technology and really technology capacity. It's an undifferentiated specialization rather than a completely clear specialization about one industry or one market. So this is the, so this right here, how many of you guys, oh, I know some of you really do remember this part for this competition that Columbus was in and ultimately won. Subsequent to that, there was the Amazon headquarters competition. And this is the set of cities that got made the first sort of round here. And all of them are competing about whether or not can have an Amazon facility, which is not particularly differentiated, right? They're looking for the same sorts of basic capacity. So we see this as the Sidewalk Labs did this, right? And then we see things like Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Navy Yard, City Market, Chelsea Market. All of this sort of, you can do it anywhere if you have the basic sort of high-end stuff, right? So this idea that you have to be an actor that you rubber, that kind of specialization is not what this new sort of variation of the situation looks like. So really what we see is this emergence of cities as organizing platforms for the kind of high-tech economic behavior that's relatively undifferentiated. So if you think about some of the conversations in Central Ohio, this idea of trying to really build that connectivity, because one of the pieces that Central Ohio has in less measure than other places against which we are competing for this platform is connectivity, right? Connectivity is one of the things that this region has left of some of its competitors. The idea of how we actually build out community at neighborhood level amenities. And you can think about that as the redevelopments and sort of authentic spaces that are actually not that authentic, but they feel like they have historical or embedded in. The question of entrepreneurship, support for small firms, again, this idea of how we embed the capacity, and then resilience, the idea of designing for actual change. And again, we see that happening over and over again, but on a relatively small scale across different places. Anybody want to guess that one?
Yeah, you.
Yeah, do you know what the project is?
I can't remember the name of it, but it's on the Manhattan Greenway.
Oh, you got it. This is a little island, which again, I think if you can tell, they built out this park on these, I don't know what you call them exactly, but this is where the pier used to be. So they didn't get rid of the parts of the previous use that lets you know what the industrialization, when it was using the pier, now it's a park, it has an amphitheater on it. So this question of adaptation. So all of this is happening while we're sitting within a situation where we have this long legacy of industrial restructuring that sits in the background. None of this, like, put the pretty park on top of where the pier used to be. None of that happens without there being this real serious existing long legacy of industrial restructuring. And this legacy of industrial restructuring has real impacts on how people understand these projects, about what people understand is possible, and about how viable these strategies are in terms of really making substantial change. One example I would bring up is that in recent years, a number of people in development planning were looking at questions around small scale manufacturing, so maker spaces, right? Things like that. And one of the big critiques of that was, you're talking about very small level manufacturing. Now, it's great. It's working for some people. It's really interesting what kind of community develops from that, but it's not going to replace a plant that laid off 2,500 people. So this is the reality for some of the small scale manufacturing pieces. There's a discourse that's going on, and some of you may be familiar with it. It's particularly in the UK and in Europe right now. We're talking about left behind places, where they're merging together the analysis of the sort of economic disenfranchisement and the rise of the political right in particular. That you can essentially map on top of each other the disenfranchised older industrial regions, and you can sort of right-wing political movements. Looking at places like France, looking at places like the UK, checking, this sort of emerged from people trying to figure out what the hell happened with Brexit, and then they continue to look at other cases. And this conversation of left behind places has now started to be in the US as well. You see Brookings Institution, we got see the Biden administration is starting to look at this language as well, as they start to look at how they're going to do place-based industrial and innovation development. And just to give you a sense of what some of the challenges in terms of the transitions, that we really haven't been that great at managing. I mean, a big part of the story here is these things have been very difficult, in terms of transition. So when we think about things like green transition, we think we don't have a great track record on managing sort of industrial transition, which is one of the reasons you get some sort of popular skepticism around questions like green transition, because there are people who look back and say, you didn't handle the last transition all that brilliantly. Why do you think you're actually going to be able to do this without a lot of job loss and community disruption? So one of the things to keep in mind in this context is that we're talking, one of the things that's happened in this 4 years transition is the rise of labor flexibility. And labor flexibility has done a couple of things. It has shifted the responsibility for healthcare, much of Social Security, and much of labor market reproduction to individuals. I know many of you guys probably have student loans, or at least know about student loans, or recently got your student loans forgiven. So this is part of labor market reproduction actually assigned to the individual, passed on to the individual. And increasingly, the responsibility for providing the platform for performing work has shifted to work around the city. And this is one of the themes in Uneven Innovation, my most recent book, is this argument around the question of the work, the city's actually become a platform for the production of precarious work. Anybody want to guess this one? This image? It's Paris, and it is actually excellent. It's actually a protest that was going on about police violence. So we think about Black Lives Matter as being very much something that was in the US. It was actually not just in the US. There were actually protests, because this whole question of the anxiety people feel is really significant. And so I think it's always important to understand that people have a lived experience of regional industrial change. Like they don't just, it's not just something that we're mapping out. So I just mentioned a couple of books that I think have been really, really helpful in understanding how this restructuring and negotiating and the employment relationship has happened. And keeping in mind as well, this is a very recent book by Nicola Lowe that I would recommend to people, that has in particular a lot of policy recommendations based on looking at different categories, looking at different cases and finding some of the best practices that have developed. And then for my part, this is the sort of what I've been working on with the add-on of a methods book, because I got frustrated about research design. I'll do it again. I'll do it with you. But so this is one of the things that my work has really brought forward, at least to my thinking, is how important market intermediaries, labor market intermediaries, of course, I've always been focused on, but market intermediaries and networks more broadly. And that there's a huge amount of variation in regions about the density of those, and also sort of how they're provisioned, public, private, or really left to as gaps. So how do you manage change while it is actually happening? One is that the focus on disruptive product innovation in much of our discourse and much of our policy is really sort of distracting us from where the really important innovation needs to be focused on and managed. And that includes really understanding what incremental innovation means to production. So looking at materials and processes. So this is one I spent a lot of time when I was at Community Tech working with engineers on different projects around on innovation. And the thing that really struck me after doing all that work was how little time economic developers and economic development planners were talking about materials and processes. We're always talking about the iPhone, all these books about the iPhone, and nobody was really talking about what was going on in terms of all of that adaptation that has to happen well before you get to that. And also, obviously, that there's real changes in that your intermediaries have to adapt to all of that as well. And then second, that these institutions, of course, really matter for defining the management characteristics. This one's Glasgow. Glasgow backs the miners. I don't know how many of you guys know your UK, but the miners, I would have expected to see this in like 1982. This is actually a picture I took about 2015. So like, people really think about this stuff. It sticks with them. You know, it really isn't just we have to understand the legacy of changing people. Managerialism and entrepreneurialism, I think especially for those of us who are thinking about what scale of intervention we use to deal with these questions. There's a really an important article by David Harvey called From Managerial Business to Entrepreneurialism. It's from 1989. But what I think is really to take back from that article, and I think we don't talk about it enough, is the question of, do we want something like the city? Do we want them to manage things, or do we want them to be entrepreneurial in their actions? So a management type approach would be make sure the garbage is picked up, make sure that the street lights work. That's the managerial approach. The entrepreneurial approach is really where we see economic development happen. Figure out a strategy for what kind of firms you want to attract. Figure out what kind of private-public partnerships you want to advance. We sort of take as given now that we expect our public sector to be entrepreneurial in those ways, but it is in fact not a given. Managerialism was one approach, and in some places it remains an approach. And even in the US, we talk about where there's significant variation there. So what have we learned about resilient regional innovation systems? I bet you guys can guess where this is. I loved this one because honestly, I took this picture from the parking garage across from the Old Hall. And that day, I was so in my role, I get to make job offers to people we're gonna hire. It was like so much fun. But the guy we were about to make a job offer to actually worked on concrete. And so it was like I was getting out of the car and this big thing about concrete out there. I'm like, this is so a sign. This is gonna work out. This is gonna work out so beautifully. He actually works on the production of on how people in Angola use concrete to create different urban spaces. So and those blocks, I swear the concrete blocks, they're called blockos. Like you guys, he didn't know that. He gave an entire job talk talking about blockos, and all of us in the room were just like, "This is cool." So that was two signs. That was two. That he was the right person. We just to talk about the issue of, and you can read all of this. What you want to be able to do is actually you want to support rather than suppress disruptive innovations. I put that forward there because this goes back to the question of power and firm networks. You very often have large firms who are not all that interested in disruptive innovations from other firms that are not themselves. So they will try to not support them, or they will try to buy them up. This merger and acquisition sort of stuff. So in terms of the policy, you want to figure out ways to not have that happen. So what would a resilient regional economy look like in this context? One of the things I advocate for is this idea of re-territorializing demand and distribution. And one of the arguments in economic geography that's pretty broadly talked about is this idea of strategic coupling, part of how global production networks work. It's really hard to actually make major adaptations in sort of your priorities if you are strategically coupled to an entire global production system. You actually have to think about how you're going to break that back down. And so this essentially ideas that you probably heard the Biden administration talks about these things like friendshoring, or efforts to strategically decouple from global production networks. Not entirely, but certainly on part of in ways that are aligned with values or priorities. And then this is a question of how you think about distributed systems like solar, water, and certainly questions around food. I don't know if you guys have any. You do have people who work on food. I do. I think it's a really helpful empirical question to pick individual pieces of this individual sectors and actually test out how this is happening or how it can happen. So the role of institutions in the resilience of regional economies, I really think that this is where you have to have institutions and intermediaries that are capable of managing the change. And that is one thing in the United States. We typically have much weaker market intermediaries than in some of the other industrialized countries. And this is one of the things that investment would need to create. Now, this has a lot to do with the question of whether we think, there's a debate around whether these should be public sector or private sector, and that's part of the reason they are, we are contested here. So one of the arguments I make is that the talent is already here. Like, we have lots and lots of talented people here. It's kind of a question of how to deploy them, right? Like, how to get this all into an organizing function. Do you guys know what this is?
That's inside.
Hmm?
That's inside Milton.
This is Molten Hall. So this is for those of you guys who have not ever experienced this. We do this at the beginning of every semester, and actually at the end of every semester. Everybody gets on the big stairs. This is sort of a cultural thing. The first time I had to do, and of course, you have to stand down there and say what you're supposed to say about your division. The first time they had me do this, they gave me, I think, about 10 minutes notice to do it, because they'd all done it every, they do it every semester. It wasn't on a calendar or anything. It wasn't like, there was no notice of it. It was just like, yes, of course you're supposed to go up and talk to all these people. And it is really intimidating because they are all hanging out off the sides and everything. But it does really give you an impression. Certainly when I'm sitting there doing that, I'm like, this is the most amazing experience. All of these people are being trained to do something, right? We are here to influence all of these people. This is a moment. So whenever I do that, I try to say something inspirational and not just announce what the next speaker is likely to be. And then finally, the idea of advocacy versus anxiety, that managing incremental processes really does help minimize that political anxiety if we take these on as smaller steps, rather than saying to people, we're going to, completely change to a green transition process. Like, this scares people. And so the question of how to actually take this on as an incremental project, I think is a really important point. And then finally, I think it's important to remember that this is our future that we're writing here, and that we can do this ourselves. And it's going to take a little bit of work. Anybody know what this one is? It says Wynwood Walls, and this is at Shepherd Ferry, but Wynwood Walls in Miami is where they do all the graffiti, and they commission graffiti artists and of all sorts to come and do amazing things in this space. And so that's one of them too. And you can see just a little bit at the top there, the gentrifying building going up right behind it, because of course now that it's an art space, gentrification problems. And that's what I have for you today. I'm happy to talk to you, answer questions. Whatever you think.
Yes, so where does, we hear a lot about like, oh, the answer is that we're gonna upskill workers. And we're gonna take traditional manufacturing trained labor force and upskill them and retrain them onto the green economy.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. And I just wonder if you could speak about like, is that a strategy with actual action points behind it, or as far as you can tell, is that really just sort of a thing that people say? Does that fit in?
It is both of those things.
Sure.
So I would say, I think one of the big challenges, so you notice I always talk about it as labor market restructuring or labor market intermediary. Partly because if you call it workforce development, you get paid about 30% less. So I always encourage my students to call it working on the labor market, not workforce development. But also workforce development sits on the supply side, right? Whereas labor market restructuring and thinking about labor markets allows you to be thinking about demand and supply at the same time, right? So, and the institutions that provision it. So one of the things that concerns me is how much time we take spending on sort of looking at the people and saying the people need to be different, and how little time we spend looking at the firms and thinking about what's the transition of practice in terms of the demand side, right? And that's harder because you can't, the market's not just gonna create intermediate jobs for this transition in numbers that, or at least we didn't see it in the last industrial transition, I should be clear. specific about it. We didn't see that happen in sufficient numbers to actually ease the transition the previous time we went through a significant industrial transition. I think that you would have to have some public sector intervention on the demand side too. Now, what that looks like is a much more managed approach, and I don't mean that the economy needs to be managed. I think that the public sector would have to have a lot more information about what's going on in terms of how firms are, what they're looking for, and actually who they need, right? We have hollowed out many things in the last 40 years, and one of them is a lot of knowledge that used to exist within labor market intermediaries like unions, who knew something about what was going on in the production process, and also knew something about the skill set and pulled those things. As unions got pulled apart, one of the things that happened is you lost one of those key labor market intermediaries that could help you actually negotiate that space, right? So if people don't want collective bargaining, they're gonna need to do something else, right? The absence of it entirely is a gap, I think. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
What are the implications of your work, and it's showing up in your journal too?
Yeah.
Is the difference really about government versus governance? And Europe's position to take much more of a government-led approach, and in the United States, we don't have too much choice but governance. So I guess the question is, how do you actually research that stuff?
Yeah, so this is the research question on some of it. I struggle with this.
By the way, that'll show up in the April Fool's Day lecture. as well.
No, I think it's really good to do that. And I've been struggling with this partly, because I see so much empirical work come in through the journal now, right, through the main section of the journal. And in addition to just what I'm doing with my own students and what I want to be doing too. What happened during COVID was that people couldn't do a lot of the deep field work that they did previously. So one can debate whether or not field work is too anecdotal and all of those qualitative, we can set that aside. Even the people doing very good qualitative research were really slowed down substantially. So a lot of the questions of the exploratory and the descriptive research that we need done before we get to the explanatory research where we can actually model, right, the impacts, that work is slowed down a lot. Instead, what we get is we get a lot of same argument, new evidence. Like everyone's looking for a data set because they're sitting at their computer, they can't go anywhere, but they still need to knock out an article in order to get tenure. So you get a lot of this stuff. It heavily moves things towards a more quantitative analysis, right? The issue with that is that we're proving it again, right? There's a lot of proving it again, and there's not a lot of exploration on these softer questions, right? So governance gets underexplored. Government, particularly policies that have a clear intervention, a before and after intervention, get hit over and over and over and say, okay, so we know something about how this works in this context. We don't know a lot about what the alternatives might be, right? Because we haven't spent a lot of time on that. So I think this is a tough one for those of us who mentor PhD students and junior faculty, is trying to figure out, like, there's some stuff we don't know. Like you just brought one up, like what would it look like if we actually had some interventions on the demand side of the economy to help transition this? There are some things we could look at for that, but they would actually take a fair amount of field work to look for and to document and then to evaluate, right? One of the reasons I got into the smart cities conversation was that I kept seeing policies being implemented in different cities that had never been actually evaluated anywhere. They would implement in San Francisco, and then they would go to a conference with the other city managers in Seattle, and then Seattle all of a sudden was doing it. And there had never been through any process of actually evaluating that policy in any way, right? And so this, I think of the scooters as being the absolute example of this sort of like this policy diffusion without going through a traditional, or I keep calling it traditional, deliberative policy evaluation process. And as somebody who, writes a policy evaluation book, I'm like, what is happening? But I don't know who gave them permission to do that. Like, that's the other thing, is like, I didn't know you could just decide to stop evaluating it before you implemented that. That's amazing. But that's what happened. And so I think that there is this question of how do we pull back and say, there's a rigorous and deliberative approach to policymaking and to understanding these interventions. And we need to come back to that, right, before they get implemented. Real places, real time is what I always tell my students, is like, you're experimenting on real people.
So a couple of thoughts I'm trying to put together into a question. I came for your smart city talk, so I really enjoyed your book.
You can have that, I can send you a link to
Okay.
that, yeah.
And now we just talked about governance, we talked about institutions. And in my look at smart cities, yes, it's all about those institutions that bring various sectors of the community together. You know, smart city is a platform upon which technology and all these things are enabled. But it seems to me as if there's some difficulty in identifying how these intermediaries work, primarily because for me, it's a lot about the information, and this is a whole new ballgame. What does it mean to have a smart city in terms of information? So I'm very curious in your travels, you know, if you can comment on any of that, you know. Develop the smart cities platform, the institutions, and especially the intermediaries. You had mentioned that, you know, we're sort of behind, for example, in Europe, who know a lot more about this. So just in your travels, I mean, is there anything there you
And
can
this has
comment
to,
on?
there are some really interesting efforts that have been made to build capacity, right? And you know, again, the Bloomberg philanthropies, when we made the innovation delivery teams, right? So Bloomberg philanthropies, as part of trying to sort of upgrade cities' capacity to any given city's capacity to absorb smart cities technologies, they funded a person in city government in about 12 or 15 different cities. And this was part of their effort to say like, okay, we know you're not gonna be able to do this by yourself, so we will give you a person to handle this. At the same time, the Rockefeller Foundation did this with resilience. The Rockefeller Foundation did the 100 Resilient Cities project, and they were like, there are not enough people in city government to handle understanding resilience and connect to these new models, so they put people in the cities to do this. Now, of course, you can't just plot people in city government. This is part of the, and of course, they were term limited, right? These were grants for a period of time, and then the money ran out from the philanthropy, and the question was, do the cities pick them up or not as regular people? I mentioned this as the question of like, how are they going to really do this, right? And the challenge was that when the cities did pick up the people as sort of permanent members of their teams, then they had to put them on an existing team, and city governments tend to be very siloed. Like, here's the people who do water management, here's the people who deal with zoning, like, and so what was happening is that these philanthropies who had thematic goals, right, important thematic goals, were coming in and trying to bring in themes like this across the silos that were like this, and you can't break it, right? You can't break it quite that easily. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a good experiment or that it wasn't actually a good way to start the conversation. I think it really was. But the question of how do these, the prioritization of the different technologies, that is we typically think of that as an evaluation question. We would actually we would talk to community, or we'd figure out we'd do some sort of needs assessment. There are tools for how you do needs assessments. That's not typically what's happened. Vendors drive, at least in the first couple of rounds of smart cities, vendors drove the adoption of the technologies, not so much community need, right? So if a vendor said that, oh, we'll do this for free, or we'll do this for half price, or if they said Detroit's already done it and you're Columbus and you're like, oh, we got to do it. There was a lot of that going on. So I would say vendor adoption as opposed to need driven adoption. Oh, I think that some of that is dissipated. I think that beginning period, they've learned a little bit.
So I'll bring up to, we're working with USDA on efforts to think about regionalism, right? So I'm just gonna bring up a case, and I'm hoping maybe you can point me to some literature. So a city like Denver, Because as you rightly point out, cities are like the platform for the region, right, in a lot of ways. The city of Denver schools makes a decision to source their. Suddenly, the regional producers are very upset and resentful because they weren't, because the city's driving and the city is developing this policy that then suddenly has these implications region-wide. And this is a, a real case that we're working on it. And so we're thinking from, picking up on that, we don't have strong regional government in the US, right? So what does process look like to kind of knit together the rural folks who are feeling like left out of the conversation, but are truly impacted? And so I don't know if you have like ideas on literature or cases that we could be looking at that maybe aren't food, but are other, topical areas where they figured out the rural urban divide in regionalism.
There's a couple of ways to come at that. I think the point that you're making on procurement, I think is super important. It is super important and is really under discussed. I actually was watching a talk by one of our architecture symposiums last week. And the guy was talking about, the presenter was talking about, the Erie Canal and that had been highly subsidized, the Erie Canal. And I kept thinking like, no, you're talking about procurement, like, and it was just one of those moments where you think like, okay, we need to start thinking about what, and one of the things that I've been really interested in is in the cross-national comparison. In the Canadian government, Industry Canada, which is an agency in particular, is very focused on procurement. They don't do anything without thinking about how the procurement actually affects whatever locality, whatever community, women entrepreneurs, indigenous entrepreneurs, like they think about this the whole time, right? And I think in my experience with them, it's because they have a deeper understanding of how those supply chains actually work. I remember once getting called by, oh my God, it was the people who, is Philips the one that's out of Amsterdam? It's one of those like electronics companies. And they wanted to know, they basically wanted to contact with somebody to figure out whether.
Phillips Design Company.
Is that what it is? Oh, okay. So this was the craziest, nuttiest thing that they wanted. Walmart had decided that they wanted to do a Buy America idea. Like they were going to give better shelf space in Walmart to products that had 80% or more American content, right? Or US content. But they had no idea where the pieces of all of their final products were actually produced. Like they did not know how to figure out the baby monitor, how much of it actually had, if it had 80% US produced content, because they didn't know where all the factories were that went into it. Like, who do you think knows if you don't know? Like, what do you think, like, how? So that's part of what I think it is that decisions are made and we don't understand what their cascading effects are until we've really done something damaging to someone. And they come forward and they say, you made this damaging decision. And then you're in a much different conversation, right? So I can't help you, I think. But I think I can tell you that it's not atypical for there to not be a clear understanding of how much the implications of a procurement decision actually are.
And just like further drives this like urban focus and the divide that people experience politically. They're making all the decisions and it's impacting us and they don't understand how that's happening.
Right,
So,
right. And then we have a negotiation and process issue that we got to deal with. And so luckily we have skills in our discipline to deal with that too. But it didn't need to happen, right? Like it is possible to actually know these things before you do them. And knowing that the rural areas are both where we get things from and also where we dump things, right? I mean, it's both ends of the production system. We use rural areas and in ways, I mean, we cities use rural areas in ways that they have every right to resent some of this, right?
Yes, I have a question for you. So, I'm gonna ask you to think both about your students that you have access to that you're teaching and also sort of more broadly, like all of these students at the university. So we've talked about sort of government and governance issues, but then we've also really talked about supply chain issues and production issues and markets. And I'm wondering if you if there are one or two skills, and skills including sort of ways of thinking, it could be sort of, particular skill, conceptual skill sets, if there are one or two skills that you think, you know, if we could arm students, which is the future workforce, the labor market, affect the labor market, with sort of one or two skills of thinking about how these cascading effects happen.
Yeah.
What would those be? Or what are those we're teaching now?
Yeah, and one of the reasons that well, I came back to urban planning, my PhD is in urban planning, I came back after being in a policy school for 14 years, and one of the reasons that I wanted to come back was because I didn't feel like space and place had as much. So, you know, you go back to the whole place-based policies versus people-based policies debates, and I felt like I was too far away from my place-based sort of roots, and I wanted to pull a little bit closer to that. So I think one of the things that I find with students is this question of understanding how to do multiscalar analysis. So I think very often we present students with an idea, and it's hard because you can't throw them into the deep end of the pool and be like, it could be a regional thing, it could be a national thing, it could be a super national thing. You can't really throw them into the deep end of the pool that way. But you do have to get them starting to think about how things are multi-scale, right? So that they understand that some interventions only exist in some places. There's different political coalitions that influence at different scales, and there's different tables at which decisions are made, right? So particularly if they are going to go into practice, you know, I think about things like home rule and the difference of the way states and cities in some places are going back and forth about, like, cities are making progressive decisions, so the state decides to make a law that you can't do that. So the scale changed, right? Like essentially the scale of where the decision making happens moves. So if you're training people to be involved in coalitions, to be advocates, they have to understand that sometimes if the decision isn't going somebody's way at this table, they're going to move it to over here. Like that's about multiscalar organizing. And so I think that that's something that at least, you know, I feel like is kind of in the bones of people who do urban planning, because we never are in a discrete space, right? So I think that's one of the big ones. I think sequencing to me is a really big one. I think it's really hard sometimes for students to understand how important sequencing is, and particularly when they're making they're doing research designs, but also when they're analyzing a situation to see what came first, what's antecedent, what's subsequent. I mean, this is not, again, it's almost like if you think about it as modeling, like, you know, what's your independent variable, what's your dependent variable, what were the antecedent, like you have to, and I think that's really conceptual clarity. So that sequencing is really about getting conceptual clarity. I often will have my students just sit there and like make little conceptual maps with me until it clicks into their head and they're like, oh, that was my research question. So I think the visualizations can be super, super helpful when it's complicated issues. I don't know if that was helpful, but that's, yes. I guess that's the mapper. Yeah, that's like map the idea.
Well, I mean, really what you've just said is, it's, both of those things are about conceptual mapping rather than empirical mapping.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
conceptual modeling rather than empirical modeling. And you have to, conceptual modeling has to happen first, or else the empirical modeling is rather hollow.
Right, and I increasingly have students who come to me with they'll come to me with data, right? But they're not coming to me with a conceptual question, right? And so it's harder to, they think it's easier because they're like, I got the data, I'm ready to go. And I'm like, no, we gotta build it this way.
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask you, you made a comment about your research design. And so now some of our students are in a research design class right now. And I'm curious, what is in your book? Like, I don't know, what are you, or your research methodology
yeah.
book? And you're like, I got frustrated with what was going on, so I had to write another. So I'm curious, what is it, like, what are your?
I'm actually super lucky because that basic methods of policy analysis and planning actually came out, and Ned probably knows all this, in 1986 for the first time. And that I was not an author on it. But it was originally written by two colleagues, Carl Patton and David Sawicki. Carl Patton ended up being president of Georgia State University, came out of the Andrew Young School, and David Sawicki was at Georgia Tech. And when we got to the third edition, I inherited the dream of the. And so, one of the reasons I was willing to do that is that I had seen this book, you know, when I was coming up, and it was the only book that I had read. Apologies for wine reminding. But it was the only book where I felt like the people were talking to me like a person. Like they were, like the book was actually talking to me about circumstances that I was actually gonna, it would happen to me, like, hey, you know, you are the mayor or the mayor's, you know, primary research staff person comes to you and says, I need to know what this, I need an analysis of this and I need it by next Tuesday. Like, what are the tools you're gonna use to actually give them a viable analysis? But it's gonna be a quick analysis. It's not going to be, you know, a dissertation on it. And so it goes through all of these things of like, what is rigorous, defensible, appropriate ways of doing these things? And understanding time constraints, political constraints, and all of those other issues. It also has an entire chapter on ethics. And for me, that was one of the things that really changed, put it in a different category when I was coming up. And again, why I still dig this book is that the idea that we need to have that sustained conversation about ethics. I just think is really, really important for students, and they need to have it in research design even more so now than they did before. I know we get emails right from the university that says, do your human subject certification. And
Or
like,
they are training.
CR training, everyone. And those things are important, and the compliance side of it has gotten up and up and up. But I think the real things about ethics when you're in a practice-based field like this is the stuff that's actually gonna happen to you. Like, you're really going to experience these things where you have to decline to be a part of things. And then decide what you do at that point. Is that something that you duty to report? And I'm not even talking, but I'm talking about really like things that are just on the wrong side of an ethical line. And I think having open conversations about it is a really important thing. And I think it's part of research design. I see some research designs come in. I do a lot of mentoring of students internationally too, and I realize like some of these are cultural, like, I mean, you come from different cultural contexts and sort of where the line is sometimes a little bit different, and the discipline has to have a line. That was a really fun bit.
Questions?
So you could, in your next revision, you can take the ethics chapter, put in the ones, and you do not contract for results.
Right, right, kind of, you know.
Cool, all right, well, thank you so much. If there's any other questions.